end, and then I will definitely leave some time to dialogue. Now, as you can see, the title, The Origins of Landscape Painting in Western Art, I am not going to talk about Eastern landscape painting. Of course, there is an amazing repository of beautiful imagery coming out of what would be today Asia, but it would be so complicated for me to try to combine Western and Eastern landscape painting. So of course I am going to focus on Western landscape painting. It also is because that is, our museum is dedicated to American art, Western art and icons. And so I'm kind of staying on that focus. Now, I'm going to forward to a beautiful image, and let's hope it's working. I don't know why that isn't moving forward. Oh, here we go. Sometimes my computer glitches, so please bear with me. As you can see, this beautiful landscape with Sharon, and we will talk about this as this Netherlandish, but I just want to go over some of the aspects of landscape painting, the history of it. And the earliest landscapes actually originate in the Minoan culture on the island of Santorini. This is perhaps one of the earliest landscapes ever known. We do have landscapes from Egypt, ancient Egypt, which were created about 1350 BC. So they're a little later than this Minoan landscape. And we will look at right now this beautiful Minoan fresco. And it is a triptych, meaning it is three-sided. Now, you may look at this fresco and say, a little banal, not so exciting, but think about it. This is the first time landscape is done for landscape's sake. And there's so much about it I'd like to describe to you that might make you really appreciate it. Perhaps it's good to talk a little bit about the history of the island of Santorini. Probably some of you have actually visited. I've been fortunate to have seen these and have visited. Now, there's an amazing repository of ancient art and artifacts called aquateria. And, you know, when people think about buried cities, they think of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which were much later than these. They were actually, I think Vesuvius erupted at 79 AD. These are from 1600 BC, so quite a bit earlier. Aquateria was buried by an underground volcano on the island. Sometimes they call it Thera, or that's the ancient name, or Santorini. When the volcanic eruption occurred, fortunately, people were aware of it for some reason, and they fled the island. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, that wasn't the case. So, you know, you have that aspect of buried bodies, and many people died. In Aquateria, we do not have this host of fatalities. Pretty much people fled. So what we do have, however, is a buried city. If you ever go to the island of Santorini, I hope you do visit Aquateria, and you can actually see some of the beehive-like structures, and you can also go see some of the artifacts in a nearby museum. But let's look at this. We do not know the origin of the painter. This was done on fresco. It's a fresco, of course, and that is a technique of mural painting, which is executed upon freshly laid wet limestone plaster. The paintings with natural pigments would be painted over that plaster setting. It would dry and create a fresco. And of course, the Italians used it and the Greeks used it. Now, this is Minoan, pre-Greek classicism, for example, or archaic Greek or Hellenistic Greek, Minoan culture. What are we looking at? We're looking at beautiful rock outcroppings, and they're done in these exquisite grays and sort of burnt umber and yellows. And then we have these lilies emerging from the rocky outcroppings. And I want to show you, and I really hope my cursor works. Sometimes it doesn't. Again, my computer, I apologize. Here we have some birds. And if you can't see my cursor, they're in the center panel of the fresco, of the main wall of the fresco. And there are two birds here. It was originally thought those were lovebirds. How charming. But ornithologists have come back and said, no, actually, they're fighting birds. And that isn't really that important to the fresco, but I do want you to see that it is really the first time the natural world is portrayed with the plants and the outcroppings, and of course, this remarkable bird configuration. We're going to move on and hope that my computer advances. And we are going to look at a landscape scene from the Odyssey. And remember, probably from college, you read the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. And this is a scene from that manuscript. It was done in Rome. Now, there are some beautiful frescoes in Herculaneum and Pompeii that have been uncovered, and I've shown those in the past. But this is basically the finest example of figurative and landscape painting being incorporated. Now, there were 4 styles of Roman fresco paintings, and we are looking at what's called the second style, or the architectural style. How do we know that? Well, we have this trompe l'oeil, or fool the eye, capital and column. I would probably say this is a pilaster because that means it's an engaged column, but we have a capital, and it has elements of what we say Doric and Ionic. The elements, Doric would be this flat, less than ornamental structure, and then the Ionic with this curved stroll, more feminine. That comes from the Greek, of course. But this is the second style of wallpapering, architectural. Now we have these figures from the Odyssey, and remember Odysseus in Greek and Ulysses in the Roman vernacular. So this is, we'll call him Ulysses, and we'll see him in this landscape activities. Now, how does an early landscape painter in this fresco create perspective? Because really, landscapes require a form of perspective. How did the artists, way before perspective was really a focus in painting, that doesn't come to the early Renaissance, the proto-Renaissance, but how did the artists do it? Well, I'm going to just share with you a very clever trick. What the artist does is he makes the paint in the foreground much darker. Well, I wouldn't say much darker, slightly darker. As you recede to the background, the paint is lighter, and that for our eye creates a more of a distant factor. So that is where you are seeing actually a remarkable three-dimensionality, because it's not a super flat surface. So you have the rocky outcroppings, almost reminiscent of the Minoan image that I just showed you. And then we have boats, and we have boatmen here, and we have these figures climbing the rocks. So we have a very remarkable aspect of early landscape painting. Now, I sort of shortchange what I wanted to say about Chinese and Asian landscapes, because if you just joined us, I mentioned that, of course, the Chinese had an incredible history of landscape painting dating from the 6th century. But as I mentioned, we just have not enough time. But why I bring it up again is this. In Chinese landscape painting, which began in the 6th century, as I just said, it was a very revered art form. It was mostly done in pen and ink. What was the focus? Water, waterfalls, and of course, the landscape. With Western art, particularly in Europe, we do not see a real devotion to landscape painting until much later. Why is that? Well, I'll give you a couple reasons. Landscape painting was not considered an important genre. History paintings were considered the most important genre. And when I say history, it is an umbrella that includes mythological paintings, religious paintings, as we're looking at right now, history. And so landscape, still life, wasn't important. It wasn't on the hierarchy of landscape. But in China, for example, ink and brush landscapes were very revered. They knew who the artists were. They really focused on that, but it is different in Western art. So we'll continue with that thought. So Giotto really is the father of Renaissance painting. And he was a student of the great Cimabue, and he practiced in Florence. And you're looking at a very early fresco, 1300. And again, if you just joined us, fresco is a technique of mural painting executed upon a freshly laid white plaster wall, and then the paint with natural pigments is set into the wall as it dries. And this was a fresco from the Arena Chapel. Well, it's the St. Francis Church in Assisi, but it is part of the Arena Chapel. And if you ever get a chance, you absolutely have to see it because it's some of the most remarkable frescoes in Italian art, as were the ones in Siena, the bad government and good government. Now, what do we have here? There's something that Giotto brings to the beginning of the emergence of landscape painting, and that is the use of more perspective, which is required in landscape painting, and there's a hint of three-dimensionality. Remember, he comes from the school that studied Byzantine art, which is very flat, and Giotto breaks that mold. He goes out of that very restricted, very flat kind of style, and he goes to a much more emerging on three-dimensionality. So we have a very simple church here, and of course, a medieval city. And then we have St. Francis gently handing to a man his mantle. And of course, St. Francis was a man of humility and kindness and generosity and vows of poverty, I believe. So it would be not uncommon for him to proffer something. And what is also remarkable, look at the colors, it's very saturated reds. And then we also have this element of transportation, a horse. So when you bring an element of transportation, you consider the idea of movement. And that's what we sort of see here. You don't see, obviously, the horse moving, but it gives us, the hoof, is uplifted, and you get the feeling that the horse will continue. So St. Francis offering to a man a mantle in this exquisite emerging landscape. Now, after the Minoans and the Romans, any form of landscape painting, before we just showed you the Giotto, really didn't exist very much. But one area of art that was really instrumental into the evolution of landscape painting is manuscript illumination. The Dutch and Flemish, the French, amazing manuscript illuminators. It's particularly true of the Burgundian court. And the Limburg brothers were Dutch, and the Burgundian court controlled that region of what would be the Netherlandish region until the Habsburgs came in a bit later. So the Limburg brothers, although they were Dutch, they were under the auspices of the Burgundian court, and particular the Duc de Berry. And so the Le Très Riches, of course, French, the very rich hours, reflects that French influence. Now the Duke was very wealthy, and he was a bibliophile, and he commissioned this amazing manuscript. Of course, if you look at the date, it was made during a period of about 4 years. The printing press had not been invented. That was until 1440. So, of course, that was with Gutenberg. So here we have all books handmade, and they would take years sometimes. And the artists who worked on them were amazing. And some of the greatest artists that we will have seen and we will look at, for example, Petrus Christus, Jan van Eyck, they trained oftentimes as manuscripts illuminators. Now, what were the Le Très Riches? They were a book of canonical prayers and calendars. So of course we have months of the year. I may be wrong in my titling. I do not believe this is September. I apologize, because in my recollection, September is a peasant scene. This is a scene of aristocratic activity. In Le Très Riches, you will see both peasants and aristocrats. This is one of the aristocratic ones. Now, if you were to look at, I believe, September, you would see peasants in the field working. But it's fun to look at sort of the aristocrats at play at a feast, and you don't see as much landscape. But I will tell you, landscape is very prevalent on the pages of this exquisite illuminated manuscript. Now, the sad story was, plague raged through Europe. It raged through Siena in the 14th century. It came back in the 15th century. It came back in the 16th century. And so at this time, unfortunately, the Limburg brothers passed away before this, I think it's 216-page manuscript was completed. And so other artists did work on it. Many other artists did complete it. But basically, we give credit to the Limburg brothers. But you see the emergence of landscape. We have a castle, we have a series of knights in some kind of jousting, and we have the flags, and of course, beautiful blue sky. Sky, weather, perspective, those are things that are paramount in capturing a landscape. So look at the detail on this. Some people would say that it is the most beautiful illuminated manuscript that was ever created. I have to tend to agree. All right, we're going to move on. And of course, there were other artists, and this was a little bit later. This was made after the advent of the printing press. But again, books before were very, very hard to come by. And they were usually owned by the royal courts, people of affluence, the church. And unfortunately, George Trubert, his only works that are extant today are his Christian liturgical books. And so we would only see his work in manuscript illumination. We do not, he would have said that he did paintings outside of manuscript illumination. We have no record of that. But let's just talk a little bit about St. John the Evangelist from a book of the hours, another book of hours, of prayers. Now, what we have here in the background is the Greek island of Patmos. And then we have St. John the Evangelist sitting, kneeling, and a very basic formation. And he is writing. He is illustrating or writing, and we have his writing implements, and then we have a bird watching over. And if Dee Dee, a little bit later on, I see Dee Dee's here, and she's a religious expert at the Timken. And I wanted to ask Dee Dee later, if you could hold this thought, Dee Dee, in your head, a little bit about the bird, because I do not recall the significance of the bird. And so perhaps if you know, you usually do, you can fill me in at the end, fill us in at the end. And okay, so we have this boat in this really exquisite water. It almost seems tilted, and perspective is really important, not just detailed perspective, like single point perspective, but also aerial perspective. And George Trubert worked for the King of Naples primarily, which is kind of interesting. And he did do some Italian. I think he was born in Provence, and he did work for some of the Italian court. So not as much is known about him, but we do have some Latin here in this beautiful water. But I wanted to show you how important manuscript illumination is to the development of landscape painting. Now, when we think of Pages Christus, we think about one of the greatest Flemish painters. And I was talking with our educational director, who's an art historian as well, Christina Rosenberg, and we were talking about this thing about Netherlandish and Flemish. And so it's really hard, because even though we say Netherlandish, because that region was one region until the separation during the Protestant Reformation, at this time, it was one area, and it was pre-Protestant Reformation. So that whole Netherlandish region is, I'll just call it that, Netherlandish. And he was one of the greatest Netherlandish painters. Pages Christus studied with Jan van Eyck. So he continued this use of oil painting that Jan van Eyck really helped to develop. He didn't invent it, but he helped to develop. So you can see these really rich colors that come from Pages Christus. And as the way, Jan van Eyck to Pages Christus. The other thing that Pages Christus is known for is developing single point perspective. Really important, because you're beginning to see perspective here. Rich colors and perspective. So the Virgin is in an archway. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do not see in the early part of the 15th century or mid-15th century landscapes for landscape's sake. They always have to be subservient, so to speak, to other historical, religious, mythological paintings. But these artists began to look at the natural world and really want to think about light and beauty. And so they began to use that in their religious paintings. And of course, this is a very religious painting. It's an oak on panel and it's in Hungary. And so we have this beautiful rendition of the Virgin, and she holds the Christ child with a crystal orb. Salvator Mundi, savior of the world. And then we have these pilasters, these engaged columns with Adam and Eve in gold. And they use a lot of gold leaf in these paintings. And that comes, of course, from the Byzantine. And look at this landscape. You can see that these artists had a knowledge of miniatures because of the hyper detail. The boats are like millimeters, and these exquisite trees and this outcropping, and always some kind of architectural element. And there is a sense of perspective. You get the floor, the ledge, and then, of course, the landscape beyond. So she holds them with quite a bit of tenderness, and he's savior of the world. And then we have this incorporation of landscape and in this exquisite archway. It really wasn't until the latter part of the 15th century and really into the 16th century, we began to see more of a focus on the landscape. And so let's look at the work of Albrecht Dürer. This is the end of the 15th century, and probably one of the greatest Northern Renaissance artists was Albrecht Dürer. It's funny, you know, sometimes when people think about Renaissance art, they think about Italy. Well, of course, Renaissance art was so important in Italy, but the great artists of the North were also so instrumental to developing painting in both cultures. You know, Albrecht Dürer went to Venice. He spent a lot of time in Italy. And so he was going back, he went maybe 3 trips. He started when I think he was 19, going to Italy. He wanted to get out of Nuremberg, Germany, where he was born. His father was a goldsmith. And he would go to Italy partially because he was interested in studying art there, but also because the plague kept resurfacing in Nuremberg. And so he often fled to not only grow his artistic legacy, but he also wanted to escape the plague. So let's look at this beautiful landscape, and it is water and gouache. So it's a very soft, muted medium. Well, it's actually media because we're combining 2, water, color, and gouache, but it's a much more diluted form than oil painting, for example. But what are we looking at? So this is the base of northern Italy, the Italian Alps, the Dolomites, and you can see this beautiful landscape. And this is pure landscape. So Dürer is one of the seminal figures in creating pure landscape, as opposed to landscape which incorporates historical, mythological, or religious issues. Now, I hope you can see my cursor, but I want to point out something very unusual in this watercolor gouache. You see a profile of a man in this rocky outcropping. So look closely. Now, if you can't see it from my cursor, it is on the extreme left, and it is separated from the mountaintop. Dürer was known to use artistic license, as many artists did subsequently, to take out elements of the landscape. In reality, if you were to look at this true landscape, there were lots of other mountaintops. He focuses it just on one, and it does it to great beauty. We're looking at olive and wine groves. We have olives and wine, pretty lovely. We have the sense of an aerial perspective. And Pieter Brueghel, artists like Pieter Brueghel and Joachim Packner will also incorporate aspects of aerial perspective. So we have the, as I mentioned, the vineyards you can see, and then of course these beautiful olive trees. We have a 12th century fortified town. And if you look very closely, here's the fortification, and it snakes its way up to the top very cleverly. You can just see a little bit of remnants here. It kind of snakes its way up, and then we have some here and here. So he carefully recreates this 12th century city. And then we go down to the sheer face of the cliff. so important because you see really a very sturdy formation of rocks, but we also see the very delicate trees. And Durer was a master of really studying the landscape. And if you know his famous piece of turf, it was said that he probably scooped a piece of turf out and just studied it like a botanist, because he did a lot of sketchbooks, he traveled, and he loved to look at objects of, plants and so forth. And just really quickly, I want to talk about the color. The color is remarkable, a blue-green tint. In a way, it's not exactly naturalistic. If you were to look at, as I just mentioned, piece of turf, it's very botanically correct. This is a little bit Arcadian, and I'm not going to explain exactly in great detail what Arcadian landscapes are, but they're more fanciful, more romanticized. So we'll talk about that in just a bit. But lastly, I want to point out, Albrecht Dürer had a very remarkable way of signing his images, and that was not popular. Artists didn't often sign, but he did. It's the A with a D underneath. So if you look at a Dürer, you always see that. Lastly, this is a work on paper. It wasn't, canvas wasn't really used much until the 16th century. So most of the artworks prior to that would be on oak panel. This, however, is on paper. And of course, many of these artists did sketch. So it's not that they didn't use paper, but I just wanted to point that out. Now, I think this is just a remarkable landscape. This is 16th century. And Patner, I have to say, was from the Netherlandish region, and he was actually lived near Antwerp. And Antwerp, okay, so Netherlandish, Flemish, you might just categorize it as Flemish, but that's the region of the Netherlandish region. And it is at the time of the very beginning of the Protestant Reformation. But we're not going to talk about that because this is a mythological subject matter. So what do we have here? So this comes from the Aeneid by Virgil. It also comes from Religious Last Judgment. It also comes from Ars Morbidae, which talks about how people die. So there's many literary references plus Greek mythology. There's many literary references to the Last Judgment, but we're going to focus on the Greek mythology aspect of it because that's very crucial. So Charon was known to be the helmsman of the boat that ferried you to the afterlife. And there were 4 or 5 main rivers in the underworld, in Hades. And he was known to take people down the river Styx, S-T-Y-X. And here we are. The painting is bifurcated by Charon. And it was said that once you arrived at your destination, you had to give Charon coins so he could put them on your eyelids. But what is so remarkable is this aerial landscape. And as I mentioned, 16th century, this is when we're really beginning to see the focus on landscape painting. This exquisite view of heaven and hell, and this water, this exquisite turquoise blue water, and then of course sky. So you had to have elements of water, oftentimes, not always, but the sky and the weather. And you have sort of bright light until you hit the idea of hell. And if you look very closely, this is hell with Cerberus, their 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades, and you have small figures. This painting was done around the time of the death of Hieronymus Bosch, the great Dutch painter, Netherlandish painter. And Joachim Patner was very influenced by the work of Bosch, as many artists were, who was a very religious man, Bosch. And so you literally have little quotations here, and here's hell and fire and brimstone. Many people think at this time, because plague really decimated many parts of Europe previously and then subsequently, that it also not only relates to hell, But in our own Savallo, done around the same time, we get elements of the plague, this hellish idea of the plague. So we have hell, dark, smoky, horrific. And then if we go to the other side on the left, we see heaven. And we see this beautiful fountain of immortality and this exquisite waterway, and the angels are beckoning. The figures are very small, which also suggests his focus on the landscape. Now, what's interesting about, I found this really interesting, is the figure, you think, wouldn't you want to go to heaven? You want to go here to hell? Well, this figure does, obviously pointing his face toward hell. So that is the decision of the figure going into hell. But just look at this tiny figures, which promote, even though it has a mythological theme, it really promotes the idea of landscape. So I am going to move on because we don't have as much time as I would like. Now, this is in our very own Timken Museum, the Pieter Brueghel the Elder, Parable of the Sower. By the 16th century, we really begin to see the use of landscape. And again, as I mentioned with Patiner, you see almost an aerial perspective. And this is of his own country. This is the Netherlandish region. He was from Breda, which would now be in Holland. Pieter Brueghel, if you can see the date, the Protestant Reformation started 40 years before. But because it's the early time of the Reformation, Pieter Brueghel did both Catholic and Protestant subjects. And the parable of the sower is from Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and it says, what you sow, you shall reap. And here we have a farmer, and he's sowing seeds to grow crops, correct? So crops will emerge. But on the foreground of the painting, we have Jesus proselytizing. And Jesus, of course, is trying to proselytize, so he brings in more believers. So he's also cultivating. Now, Pieter Brueghel was one of the greatest, along with Albrecht Dürer, one of the greatest Northern Renaissance painters. He comes from a dynasty of artists. His son, Jan Brueghel, called Velvet Brueghel, was a brilliant landscape painter. His son, Pieter Brueghel the Younger, was a great painter, not as skilled as his father. Pieter Brueghel the Younger concentrated more on genre scenes of peasants. And you will see in the next painting that Brueghel did too, but he loved to capture the landscape. Now, what's so remarkable about this is you see Alps. If you've ever been to the Low Countries, what would be today Holland and Belgium, there are no Alps. That's why they call it the Low Countries, because most of it's below sea level. But why do we have Alps here? Beyond poetic license, what we have is the fact that Brueghel traveled. And he went into Italy, and he did see the Alps and parts of Germany. And so he came back and thinking, wow, these Italian Alps are so exquisite. I'm going to incorporate them, use my artistic license. What he also does is create magnificent, almost translucent color. And he layered the color to get while it's opaque, it's very rich and beautiful. You can particularly see that in the vegetation and also the waterway that sort of separates this land formation. Brueghel was a very gifted painter, not only of landscapes, but of figures. Now, he worked with a man, Coke, C-O-E-C-K-E. He actually married the daughter, and this man was a printer. And he asked Pieter Brueghel, would you paint different parables? And so Brueghel said, sure, and I think he did something like 15. So that was part of his these painting of parables, but of course, incorporating this magnificent landscape with birds and trees and rocky outcroppings and houses, and of course, a church, which is so instrumental to these communities. And of course, if you look, you can see that this is one of our masterpieces in the Timken Museum. He did another one I wanted to show you, the Harvesters. Here it's pretty much, with the exception of some peasants in the foreground, this is a landscape for landscape's sake. He did begin to see humanism in his work. Humanism is, I want to capture what people are doing in everyday life. That's just a little short snippet of what humanism is about. But he wants to show people in their everyday workings. And of course, these are the peasants. And one of the reasons I did Le Trois shows with the aristocrats is I wanted to kind of a comparison. But we see the peasants and they're napping and they're working and they're eating. And you see the little pyramids of wheat that's been harvested. And of course, this beautiful, exquisite, detailed landscape in the middle ground and background. And he captured perspective. Look at this tree that is done in such botanical realism. And of course, the church lurks in the background. Lurks, and I don't mean in a pejorative way, but just kind of there hiding behind it. So here we're really seeing landscape, and it's becoming to be more elevated. Now, Leonardo da Vinci, Virgin of the Rocks. Of course, we're in the 15th century, we're in the Renaissance, and we're looking at the work of one of the greatest, most brilliant people that ever lived. He was a painter. He was interested in sculpture. He was a scientist. He was an engineer. He was an inventor. In fact, I think it's kind of funny. He petitioned the Sforza family, one of the aristocratic families, to have him come and work with them, not based on his painting, but on his military inventions, like cannons that rolled and shot out bullets or whatever. He had all bridges, hydraulics. This man was a genius. But let's concentrate on one of the most beautiful Renaissance paintings of Italian Renaissance paintings. Now, there are two versions of this painting. One is in the National Gallery in London, but we're going to concentrate on this one as the first one, the early one. And it is, okay, of course, oil on panel transferred to canvas. And we see this magnificent outcropping of rock. And it kind of encapsulates this sacred scene. And it is a very large work. It is, I believe, 6 feet, approximately 6 feet tall. So it's quite magnificent. And we do see a rocky outcropping. And we see other elements that are really important to Leonardo and subsequent artists, and that is the use of light. So we have 3 kind of important words about light, and I've mentioned them many times, but I will repeat. There is chiaroscuro, there's sfumato, and tenebrism. Tenebrism is when it's very high contrast, and you see that a lot in the Spanish Baroque. Zurbaran, Cotan, Velazquez, lots of inky black and light. So that's tenebrism. Chiaroscuro was when we have light sources emerging in chiaroscuro, light sources emerging onto the picture plane. And then we have sfumato. Sfumato is smoke in Italian, and it means a softer lighting around the face of the Virgin. This is chiaroscuro because it's a light source that falls on her. But these rocky outcroppings are so magical and mystical. And then, of course, we have the sacred scene. Who do we have here? And again, I will defer to Didi maybe at the end and say, I have read that I always read this was Gabriel, but some art historical references say Uriel. So we can clear that up a little bit later. St. John, of course, the infant Jesus, and there's prayer involved, and St. John is holding fingers in like a benediction, and Mary holds her hand over the infant, and the rocks create this sacred space. So you can see this is almost like a quote of a botanical drawing. If you remember, we talked a little bit about Dürer later, but everything is in hyper detail. Light is paramount, sky is paramount, water, and this very mystical, exquisite landscape. Because of time, I am going to have to move on, and we'll talk about the Venetians. This is, of course, 16th century, and as I keep repeating, 16th century, very important to the development of landscape painting. This is probably, and I will say, the first landscape for landscape's sake. You could argue, but many art historians feel that this is truly the first landscape. Who was Giorgione? Well, Giorgione was an amazing man who only lived to 32 years old. He died of plague. He was hyper skilled as an artist. He was revered. He studied with the Bellini brothers, and in particular Giovanni Bellini. And he also was the mentor to Titian. Not this painting, but because he lived such a short life, it was said that the next painting I'm going to show you might have been actually done by Titian, completed by Titian, but this is truly Giorgione. And what are we looking at? There's a lot of mystery around this painting. It's one of my favorites, and it's very, very Venetian. How is Venetian Renaissance different than Florentine Renaissance? Florentine Renaissance, there was more attention to line. In Venetian Renaissance, the light in Venice is so exquisite. There was more of an attention to coloration and light. So when you look at some of these Venetian paintings and you compare it to a Florentine or Roman Renaissance painting, you'll see a slightly different variation. So color, light, and he really, the saturated color, he layers it. And what are we looking at? So we're looking at a woman, and she's nursing a child. But what's very unusual is that you actually see her pelvis. That's not so common. And then we have a figure in what's called contrapposto. That's a term used in sculpture, and it means relaxed hip. One leg is straight and one leg is relaxed. And it's taken from sculpture. So this is a figure watching this scene. Lord Byron looked at this, thought it was the most amazing magical painting. He thought about it a lot. And as I do, not that I'm Lord Byron, but just how magical and mysterious. And it was said that this might be Giorgione's own portrait, that he was looking at this beautiful woman of unrequited love. Some people say it was a gypsy, but suffice to say, we have a figure glancing at this woman and this amazing sky. What is a tempest? It's a storm. When you think about Shakespeare, the tempest, a storm. And then we have a building. Now, very small, very tiny at the top of this building is a stork. What does a stork remind us of? The love that parents have for their children, and also, that idea of the stork and babies. But there is a stork here. And then we have the swirling sky and the light and shadow here. Truly a remarkable landscape. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move on. And this is probably Titian, although it says or Giorgione, maybe they collaborated. And this pastoral concert, it was called Fête Champêtre, and sort of an outdoor concert. And we have 4 figures. Now, this is definitely a beautiful landscape, exquisite landscape, but it also has some mythological references. It is said that these 2 men who are dressed in contemporary dress are not really looking at these nude figures, because the nude figures really exist only in their minds. And they're talking about idealized beauty. It could be, and there's many ideas about this painting, that it represents poetry and music, that the woman pouring the water in the cistern represents poetry, and of course the musician with the flute is music. Others say, no, this is about the 4 elements: fire, water, air, etc. And is it the 4 elements? Could be about the beauty of cultural poetry, music, art. And however, regardless of the mystery, you can see the skill at which he does not only the figurative elements, and you can see that later on, many artists were inspired by Titian. Titian was very famous. He worked for the courts. I forgot to mention, though, with Giorgione, Leonardo da Vinci came to Venice because, he lived in Milan for a while. He lived in Rome for a while. He died in France. But he went to Venice, and he was so captivated by Giorgione and also the work of Titian. But of course, because of time, I'm going to move on. The Rape of Europa. This is in the beautiful Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which I just adore. My husband's from Boston. I've been there many times. And many of you have visited and know that I believe it was 16 paintings that were taken right out of that museum, because it wasn't, you know, it was Isabella Stewart Gardner's, you know, palazzo, and the security wasn't very good, and they've never found the paintings, and they literally cut them out. Now, because I'm older and I met my husband many, many years ago. When we first went to Boston, the paintings were there. Subsequently, you know, I went back and back, and then one day they weren't. And you can still, I believe, some of you, I haven't been to Boston for a few years, but I believe they still keep the frames. But the Rape of Europa, so Zeus was not such a nice guy, and he often transformed himself into different elements, raindrops, coins. And here he transforms himself into a bull, a white bull. And he is whisking Europa away, and she's not happy about it. She's actually raped. I mean, think about it. She's sprawled on her back, and her legs are kind of akimbo, meaning she was caught by surprise. She's waving this red scarf, which indicates help. And you see her ladies in waiting, so to speak, are on the shoreline trying to, you know, what do we do? What do we do? And then we have these putti swarming. What do we do about this? And then we have a little putti on a, supposed to be a dolphin, doesn't look like a dolphin. But again, magnificent light and very romantic kind of landscape. It's not real, it's not very realistic, very romanticized. And you can see the water, not hyper real, again, more romanticized. And lastly, I want you to know that the bull, Zeus, took Europa to the island of Crete, where she became a queen and had 3 children. And Crete is so important to Greek mythology. And if you ever get a chance, there's some documentaries on, it's called The Rape of Europa, and how the Nazis stole so much art from Europe. So if you ever get a chance to watch that documentary, same title, really remarkable. Okay, of course. Okay, Nicolas Poussin. Nicolas Poussin, along with Claude Lorrain, were the 2 greatest Baroque landscape painters. And they were, again, very focused on landscape for landscape's sake, although we do have a mythological element here in Arcadia, at Arcadia Ego. Even here, even in Arcadia, I am here. That is the translation. And he was a magnificent landscape painter, but I just really quickly want to talk about this, because one thing that comes about in art, particularly beginning in the Renaissance and Baroque, is a sense of impending, life is ephemeral, death is everywhere. And so even though these shepherds come onto this beautiful, probably a sarcophagus, and you see it on Arcadia Ego, it means that even in beauty and sunlight and sky, death surrounds us. And we have a Greco-Roman figure, and she's looking on and saying, she puts her hand on his shoulder and says, yes, it's true. So he is incorporating mythological, very interested in classicism. He was a very intelligent person. He's French, but like Claude Lorrain, they both moved to Italy, particularly the Campania outside of Rome. So many of both of their paintings incorporate Roman countryside. And you can see that, this exquisite countryside, trees, rocky outcroppings, but we're still incorporating an element of mythology. Now, this was not a painting that was copied that much by Poussin. Landscape with Diogenes, you can see it's well into the Baroque. And perhaps it's the coloration, very muted, but very 3-dimensional, because you have a foreground, a middle ground, a background, and we have 2 castle outcroppings here. This one's much more prominent, rocky outcroppings here. And what it really tells a story of the Stoic Diogenes, who gives up everything to be, a philosopher unfettered by material wealth. And he offers a man who's drinking from a stream, and all Diogenes has is a walking stick and a bowl, a cup. And he goes, this man, this shepherd probably doesn't even need a bowl. He can cup water with his hand. So I'm going to give that up too. So again, it has a mythological reference, Greek, not mythological so much as Greek philosophy, but it is showing how instrumental Poussin, and he was the greatest French, along with Laurent, greatest French Baroque landscape painter. And this is in our very own Timken collection. And I'm going to go really quickly through this, but this is purely landscape, and it's an Arcadian landscape. So I got to talk about Arcadian landscape. So we have landscapes that are romantic, but Arcadian landscapes is very specific to romantic landscapes. We have pastoral, this is kind of pastoral. We have picturesque, great scenery, and we have sublime, which would be like icebergs. But this is Arcadian. Arcadian comes from the idea of Arcadia, which is actually wasn't beautiful from Greek history, but it was morphed into this idealized beauty that if you have an Arcadian landscape, it's almost like it's pastoral, it's beautiful, it's like heaven sent. So that's what we have here. And this is in our very own Timken collection. We have some shepherds. This is either early morning or at the end of the day. And she is washing the feet, and you see two magnificent structure, outcroppings of buildings, walled fortresses, and we have one here. We have waterfalls, all kinds of vegetation. We have the cows quietly going through this very peaceful water. Look at the clouds. Just like the Dutch, the French often studied the clouds, and we see this a lot in Baroque painting. Again, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move on. We have to talk about the Dutch. It was really the Dutch in the 17th century who did landscape for landscape's sake, because it was a Protestant country after the separation of Holland and Belgium. The Habsburg controlled what is today Belgium. We're well into the Protestant separation. Now it's completely Protestant. Well, there's, of course, Catholic residents, but it's a Protestant country, and they didn't have to worry about religious subject matter. This is very important. He's the greatest, probably. He's from Haarlem, Jacob van Ruysdael. He was so influential in landscape painting, like by Hobbema was interested in his work, a lot of Dutch landscape painters. But look at this. This is St. Bavo's. We have the high filled sky. Remember, the Dutch were very scientific. We have a low horizon line, very Dutch. And then we have linen, because Haarlem was a repository for linen. It's economic strength, Haarlem and Amsterdam. And so we have people working the field, and we have little villages of Haarlem, and we have the dunes, and then St. Bavo's, where Van Ruysdael was buried. And I was in Haarlem before COVID, 2019, I think it was. And I'm going to tell you, I looked at Haarlem, I said, he really captured it. I mean, even today, you can see this. Okay, I'm sorry to give short shrift to this magnificent painting, but I do have to move on. So this is now in the beginning of the Rococo. The Rococo, I did a talk a little while ago, and Rococo comes from the idea of rocaille, rocky outcroppings, and we have Watteau. And this is called Fête Galante, a party, and it says the embarkation. Well, some people say it's people coming to this island of Cythera, which was the birth of Venus. And as Delos was the birthplace of Apollo, you can actually visit Delos. And we have people either leaving or coming. I think they're leaving. And the reason why is because it looks like they've already paired up, and we've got lovers. And he was very interested in romantic love. And you can see the statue of Venus, and the little putti are decorating it. And this magnificent, not here. Over here, I apologize. Venus here festooned with flowers. And he really started the idea of the Rococo. And it was after the reign of Louis XIV into the 15th century. And this is the development of the Rococo. But it shows in the French how important they were to the evolution of landscape painting. Now, this is in our very own Timken collection, Corot. And this is a view of Volterra. This is a 14th century city I have visited, but there's many Etruscan and Roman ruins there if you ever get a chance. And he went to Volterra, it's in the Tuscan region, and he did many sketches. And then he'd go back to his studio and paint it. Well, Corot was greatly influential to the development of Impressionism because he was part of the movement of Barbizon painters who painted in the Barbizon woods, and they helped usher in Impressionism. And I'm so sorry, I'm going to have to move on. But the American painters, the Hudson River painters, were also thinking about the grandeur, the sublime nature of America. And people like Bierstadt, who had come from Germany as a child, went back to Germany to study with Lutz and came back. You know, in Europe, we have the grand buildings, the castles, the churches. We're a new country, as you all know. Where is our grandeur? And Bierstadt said, it's in our wilderness. So he was part of civilian artists, engineers who were helping to document what is it? I can't even think right now. From east to west, transcendental movement, I'm thinking of Bierstadt, the railroad. So the railroad is going across America, and he was here to document it. Now, photography had been invented, but here we have artists who were taken along to sketch. Choluk Falls, magnificent waterfalls. He is one of the first from the east to actually document Yosemite. And you can see the Merced River here, this beautiful outcropping, but he was very interested in the grandeur of American West. And another Hudson River painter, even though this is New England, is Fitzhugh Lane. And I just want to show you that seascapes have to be considered part of landscape. Here we have Castine Harbor in Maine, a site of a Revolutionary War battle. He was a luminous light. Remember, I told you, in order to capture a magnificent landscape, you need light. Look at this light. That's why they called him a luminous. He definitely studied the Dutch, low horizon line, big sky, lots of light. And he had trained to be, he wanted to be as a child a naval captain, but he was rendered partially paralyzed with polio. So he spent his career going up and down the eastern seaboard and documenting mostly water. Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to go over, I apologize if I could just go 2 more minutes and then we'll have questions, and I hope you can bear with me. Millet, another Barbizon painter. The gleaners, what are gleaners? Gleaners are at the lowest rung of society because they just gather up the detritus, the little bits and pieces of wheat, because they don't even have farms of their own. And so this is a commentary on poverty and class structure. Here we have, because even though Millet was part of the Barbizon painters outside of Fontainebleau, he was considered, along with Courbet, a realist, because we had neoclassicism in the 19th century. Then we had Romanticism, Delacroix, Géricault. Then we have Millet, Courbet, Daumier, and then we move on to Impressionism. And so here we have this focus on the landscape, as was part of the Barbizon painters. And then, if you remember the painting I showed earlier, done by Giorgione and Titian, Pastoral Concert, Manet, who was a precursor to Impressionism as well, although he never was Impressionist, he influenced a lot of them, he had looked at that painting and said, somehow it's so remarkable. So here we have one of the most controversial paintings at that time, and we have Le Déjeuner Célèbre, Luncheon on the Grass. And we have these men with these naked women in this remarkable landscape, complete with still life, figuration, and landscape. So I'm going to move on to the very last because we're out of time, but we can't move out of the 19th century without looking at Claude Monet and water lilies. You know, this is from Giverny. He was born in Le Havre. He painted many things multiple times because his interest is capturing light, time of day, seasons of the year, and this magnificent Japanese garden. And I hope one day you do visit Giverny. Now, that isn't to say that landscape did not carry into the 20th century, far from it. Photography is very important to landscape painting, but I do want to stop here because basically our collections at the museum stop around this time. And so for sake of time, and I see we've run out of time quite a bit, thank you for bearing with me and letting me go over a little bit. So Kyla is here and she has questions, and I also wanted to go back and see if Dee Dee could answer something for me. But Kyla, do we have Any questions so far?
No, well, first of all, thank you once again for an amazing presentation. As of right now, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so you're welcome to ask away.
Can I go back, Dee Dee, I see you're here, and just let me ask you about this.
The St. John you're talking about, yeah.
Oh, well, this one first, and then we'll go to St. John if you don't mind. The Uriel.
Oh.
So do you know the significance of the bird?
Yes, if you.
I knew you would.
That's the eagle. St. John is represented by the eagle because his gospel soars like an eagle. If you know your scriptures at all, they have what they call ascending Christology. It gets more and more beautiful or more complex. So Mark, Matthew, Luke, John is the eagle that soars over the others. On our Russian icon, Holy Door, there are the 4 evangelists represented with their animals on that Holy Door as well. So if you have an eagle, it's John. If it's the lion of St. Mark, it's the ox of Luke, and Matthew is represented by a man. So
okay, so St. John is always represented. That's his icon.
Oh, that's his symbol. So everybody would know that and relate that immediately to John's gospel. Very,
very interesting. Thank you. I knew you would know. Okay, so let's go on. We're going to go here. Uriel or Gabriel? Could you explain?
I think it's Gabriel because first of all, I don't know, that rock behind the head of that angel figure looks like wings to me. I don't know, but let's assume that it is an angel, in which case Gabriel would have been the one who announced both to Mary and maybe was the angel that announced to Zechariah about St. John's birth too. So, and she also announced, the angel announced to Hannah. So by name, I am Gabriel, you know. So I think it's one of those angels that, you know, is associated with the Annunciations.
Okay, and so, you know, I think I know you're right, because let's say in 3 out of the 4, you know, papers I looked at to talk about this painting, they always mention Gabriel, and I've never heard of Uriel used in this context. But why could someone confuse it for Uriel though?
I have no idea who Uriel is. It's not, I
think I didn't even know that.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that when they got into, what do you call it, alchemy and all that stuff, Uriel was one of the angels, and but it's very vague. It's not gospel at all. It's not scriptural, I don't think. Really, I mean it.
Yeah. And so it doesn't even really.
Yeah, I have no reason why Leonardo would need a Uriel. It's out of zone. You know what I'm saying?
And I agree with that. And
yeah,
of course, you know more about religious imagery than I do, but I would say the same thing, because everything points to Gabriel. And then this one piece talked about Uriel, and I thought, wow, it's really unusual. But you were most helpful. Thank you. I knew you'd clear up those 2 points. Do we have any other questions? Or I'm sorry I had to race through. There's such a rich heritage of landscape painting, and they're so magnificent. You could just talk about each one for quite a bit of time, because especially when there is other subject matter. But it's one of my favorite things to talk about, because it incorporates so much, and the beauty of the natural world is hard, you know, hard to go beyond. So anyway.
We do have a question on the Leonardo, I'm assuming the Da Vinci, about how and when it was transferred to canvas. So perfect that we're on that one right now.
I wish I knew I do not know the answer. That's a great question. And I don't even know how that would work, but no, I don't know. Does anybody, do you know, Dee Dee, the transfer?
No, I don't. Mm-mm.
No, I don't know. I really don't know. That's really interesting. But remember, there are 2 versions, and I don't know, I don't recall that then one at the National Gallery was also transferred. I don't think so. But you know what's really interesting about the 2 versions? You know, Leonardo was really mad because there was some story about how he didn't get all the money for a commission, so he decided to do another one. So it was kind of, Leonardo was very cantankerous sometimes, and so because people have often asked, why 2 almost, they're not identical, but they're very similar. But it's because he didn't get paid enough for one of them, so he decided to do another one, and I think to make more money or something like that. But Yes, suffices. And this is considered the more beautiful one. The other one is not as infused with light. It's quite a bit darker, a little inkier. But as I say, this is probably one of the most beautiful Italian Renaissance paintings. And it's this version, not the National Gallery one. But it's huge. It's 6 feet.
Anyway, the thing to remember about this painting, rocks, 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 rocks. So Leonardo introduced rocks.
I know.
He
Look at
tried
this.
to copy him. Yes.
Yeah, it's true. And one of the reasons why I use it, because not only is it magnificent, but just as you say, the rocks, because with, when we looked at the Albrecht Dürer, it is outcroppings of rocks, and even going back to the Minoan piece, but this is all about the rocks, this grotto. And it becomes a sacred space. It becomes this like a cave of sacred nature, and it encloses the figure, although we do have this hint of the outside world. But it's really important. I just want to make one comment. I hope I'm going over, but this idea of different landscapes like pastoral and sublime and picturesque and Arcadian, there's so many ways to approach the landscape, and also sacred. So just wanted to reiterate that. So no more questions, huh?
I do want to add a comment in that case that the book by Isaac, forget his name, Isaacson, who did the recent biography of Leonardo, basically said his first love was geology. He loved landscape and rocks, and he would have probably gone that way had he not been illegitimate and his father had been able to pay for a proper education, But as it was, he ended up drawing them.
That is a great comment, because I didn't know that. And it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Because of just the attention to detail on these rock formations.
He also guided his engineering and all that stuff he wanted to do for these rulers about moving water and a landscape. What do you do in war with landscape?
Exactly. And just like you say, if you want to project something, not project, if you want to promote something, you have to start developing ways of clearing the landscape. You want to push out, the water, and he was very good at that, and creating these militaristic kind of new instruments. You have to use a cleared space. So, and then of course, like you say, his fascination with geology. But yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you all for joining us, and we really appreciate you attending. So I'll close out now. Have a good day, everyone.
Mm-hmm. And then just for everyone asking, there's a lot of questions about wanting to watch previous tours, and this one as recorded. People apparently love this one so much they're ready to watch more and watch it again. Our lectures are posted to social media channels, which would be our YouTube or our Facebook pages. So if you're looking for those, that's where they would be located.
Right.
But yes, once again, thank you, Karen, for an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
And
so
thank you
much,
all to attend.
Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.